Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, disaster in Bangladesh. Why the media were slow to react. The sectarian divide in Iraq as seen on TV. And the president, the king, the argument, and the ringtone. Welcome back. Thousands of people have been confirmed dead after the cyclone in Bangladesh, with a death toll expected to rise above 10,000. Now compare those figures with the number of deaths after Hurricane Katrina in the U.S., fewer than 300. Then ask yourself this question. Why was there so little coverage of Bangladesh in the world's media? Compassion fatigue, the economics of journalism, racism? That's our starting point this week, the complex set of reasons why a disaster in a developing country doesn't attract as many journalists or produce nearly as many headlines as it would if the story happened in the West. Voices on the Bangladesh flood story.
Blighted Bangladesh has seen this sort of thing before.
There is no nice way to say this. There is the smell of rotting flesh in the air there.
This man's story is typical.
And the reporter on the ground, Al Jazeera correspondent Owen Fay.
They survived, but the bulk of his livelihood did not.
Well, from a journalist's point of view, this is an immensely difficult story to cover, because we're talking about getting to very remote parts of a fairly remote country. Just traveling down from the capital is a challenge because many roads have been blocked off. Many roads are inaccessible. Either they've been washed out or we've been denied access through them. And any kind of communication back to headquarters or really amongst ourselves is incredibly difficult to do. So while we're left working in one area, we can't really see the overall picture. So taken together, it's a pretty difficult story to try to cover thoroughly and properly.
When news organizations assess a natural disaster like this one of the things they consider before making the economic commitment to cover the story is how many people have lost their lives. 3 days after the storm, the official death toll was at around 2,300. Then, Red Crescent relief workers made it clear the number would eventually climb much higher, certainly above 10,000. That got the media's attention.
The death toll is a very simple way of getting a message across to the public and to the media about how big a disaster has been. I mean, everybody knows the more people who've died, the bigger disaster. The media do want to know, obviously, immediately how many people have died from this storm, but as we know from previous disasters, it can take a really long time for those figures to come in. Obviously, the Red Crescent are able to project what those final death tolls might be. Certainly there was, the media interest picked up when that first came out.
Impoverished, low-lying, and densely populated, Bangladesh has a history of deadly floods. In 1991, more than 130,000 people died after a similar cyclone. Since then, the government has established new emergency measures, cyclone shelters, and evacuation plans that, according to the government, kept the death toll down. But death tolls don't tell the whole story. They can actually obscure the big picture.
The relatively small death toll is actually masking that really huge devastation. All the work that aid agencies and the government of Bangladesh have put into saving people's lives is unfortunately not able to save their homes or their crops or their fields. So what's happened here is that there's actually a very good news story in the sense that thousands and thousands of lives have been saved, but it's still a massive disaster.
The other factor that worked against foreign news organizations going to Bangladesh was the way the story developed. Quickly.
3 million people are due to be evacuated ahead of a powerful storm in Bangladesh.
If you remember with Hurricane Katrina, for example, there was about a week where the cyclone was brewing in the Atlantic before it moved across the Gulf of Mexico and targeted the city of New Orleans. In this case, that didn't really happen. The cyclone blew up fairly quickly, and it never targeted a major city, just a very long coastline where tens of millions of fairly poor people live. So therefore, it caught a lot of people by surprise, and then implementing the logistics of getting people out here has proved troublesome as well. It remains to be seen whether news organizations now will pick up the slack and try to compensate.
Well, more than 400 people are dead in South Asia thanks to a deadly storm. A hurricane, which is called a cyclone out in the Pacific, slammed Bangladesh and forced more than 650,000 people from their homes.
One of Bangladesh's best-known writers blames the lack of media interest in the story on the West's preoccupation in South Asia with Pakistan.
I think it is not racial. I think it is political bias.
Abdul Ghaffar Chowdhury is also highly critical of the way the Bangladeshi media have covered the story. their mostly uncritical treatment of the government, which postponed last year's scheduled elections and has ruled under an emergency law for the last 10 months.
The government is using press in two ways. First, to allow them to focus on devastation so they can get more relief. On the other hand, not to focus on their inefficiency so that people will think government either incapable or unwilling to help them.
This is a country under a state of emergency, and so the government is very difficult to deal with in terms of the access that they give journalists when we're just trying to find out basic information from them.
Also playing a central role in the media mix in Bangladesh are the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, relief agencies that not only supply food to the hungry, but also feed the news media with what they need. Many have video teams shooting tape that they hope will land on someone's news broadcast somewhere.
We work through local partners, so they're on the ground immediately, and very often they can send us pictures and interviews immediately, so we're pretty good at getting the news out there quickly. And you know, in today's media environment, that is important. You know, the quicker the news gets out, you know, the more likely it is that people will pick it up, because the more coverage we can get for a disaster like this, obviously the more money we can raise and the more people we can help.
It's a very difficult country to cover. This is a particularly difficult story to cover. But having said that, there are various reasons why different media in different parts of the world look at Bangladesh and say, yet another hurricane, yet another cyclone, here we go again. Assembling reports is a bit of a seat-of-the-pants operation. On one trip that we took during the course of the week, we had to hire a speedboat that took us to our destination. It took 4 hours either way. And on the return journey, we were starting to edit the tape on the speedboat, writing a script. We're doing everything on the fly. We're improvising as we go. It's quite a challenge. It's quite difficult, but that's what we're here to do, and we're doing it as best we can.
Logistical challenges, a misleadingly low death toll, a storm that developed quickly in a low-lying land that lives below the news radar. Add to all of that the fatigue factor, another flood in a country with a long, devastating history of them.
There is a sort of fatigue in terms of yet another crisis in Bangladesh, and so therefore there's probably a certain degree of that insofar as coverage is concerned. But then, of course, the question is, at what point does it become a major story? How many lives need to be lost before the world's attention turns to Bangladesh?
Our Global Village Voices now on the coverage, or lack of it, of Bangladesh.
Global media coverage as far as the cyclone Cedar is concerned is not enough, and it was too slow. Maybe one of the reasons that they thought it's Bangladesh, you know, it happens all the time. Disaster happens in Bangladesh, but the extent of death, I mean, I've just heard from one of my colleagues in Bangladesh that death toll could be 15,000. I mean, we've seen other disasters in other parts of the world. If something happened like in the USA, Katrina or something, it would be on the TV 24 hours.
The world media coverage is very good, and hopefully they will continue, because always there is a fear that when the newsworthiness is disappeared, then the world media lost their interest to cover the whole thing. But the need will not be disappearing, I should say. So I will appeal to the world media to focus to all these things so that the needy people will get the help.
The media can seem a bit like the weather. Everyone complains about it, but unlike the weather, at least you can do something about the media. So do your part. Start by emailing us, listeningpost@aljazeera.net, and we'll show you how to sound off about the media as one of our Global Village Voices. Our News Bites section this week looks like a guide on how to suppress the media on 3 continents. The long reach of Pakistan's President Pervez Musharraf now stretches all the way to Dubai, where 2 broadcasters who beam their signals into Pakistan have been forced off the air. Geo TV and Ari TV were initially able to get around the restrictions and the new code of conduct imposed under Pakistan's state of emergency by broadcasting from offshore. However, the authorities in the United Arab Emirates have finally bowed to pressure from Islamabad and banned the two channels from transmitting from the Gulf. There have been protests in Pakistan in support of the channels, and opposition leaders, Benazir Bhutto among them, say the government's crackdown on free media tarnishes the image of Pakistan. With Russia's parliamentary elections coming up on December 2nd, media outlets and critics of the Kremlin say they're feeling the heat. Novaya Gazeta, a newspaper that's been a persistent thorn in the side of President Vladimir Putin, says it's been forced to close a regional bureau in Samara after local government officials confiscated their last remaining computer. Novaya Gazeta is the paper that employed the late Anna Politkovskaya, well-known critic of Putin and the Chechen War, who was murdered in 2006. The official reason for shutting down the bureau? The police accused the editor-in-chief of using pirated software, like that's never happened before in Russia. To Somalia, where according to the UN, the worst humanitarian crisis in Africa is taking place, worse than Darfur. This past week, the authorities there closed down 3 independent radio stations in Mogadishu, leaving the capital without any independent news outlets. The country is currently embroiled in a conflict between the transitional US-backed government and Islamist fighters. The lack of news coming out of Somalia and the difficulties aid agencies are having getting in make it hard to get the real story, but the UN says thousands have been killed in the fighting, hundreds of thousands more displaced. Yahoo, the internet company, is spending a lot of money digging its way out of the mess it found itself in China. Yahoo's executives were forced to answer questions from a U.S. congressional committee recently about their involvement in the arrest of a Chinese journalist, Shi Tao, in 2005. Tao and the blogger Wang Xiaoning were both imprisoned after Yahoo effectively handed them over to the Chinese authorities. Yahoo has also reached an out-of-court settlement in a lawsuit brought in California by the families of the 2 jailed men. Yahoo's chief executive, Jerry Yang, has since announced the creation of a human rights fund dedicated to imprisoned cyber dissidents and their families. Another dissident was jailed in China just last week for 5 years. Finally, first there was the televised shouting match. Now comes the ringtone. The public feud between Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez and the King of Spain has become a multimedia event. President Chavez and King Juan Carlos faced off at a summit meeting in Chile recently when Chavez kept interrupting the king and Spain's prime minister. Chavez repeatedly called Spain's former prime minister, Jose Maria Aznar, a fascist and a snake over Aznar's support of an illegal coup against Chavez in 2002. When Chavez refused to back down, King Juan Carlos eventually snapped and told him in Spanish to shut up. That video became a hit on YouTube. Now you can get a t-shirt, and a ringtone that captures the moment has been downloaded 500,000 times not only in Spain, it's also been adopted by anti-Chavez groups in Venezuela. We're back after the break with a story about sectarianism and the news media in Iraq.